Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Coach's Corner, SCA Coach's Corner. We've got a follow-up episode tonight on the Book of Five Rings, the Water Book, one of which we did the first episode a few months back. We've had a lot of other topics we've covered in the meantime, but we're excited to get back to talking about this one. Just as a bit of a recap, the Book of Five Rings is Miyamoto Musashi, probably the most famous Japanese swordsman of all time. He wrote a condensed but very thick book on strategy and combat from a single fighter perspective, as well as for small groups. And he broke them into different books: the ground book, the water book, fire book, wind book, and then the Book of the Void, or the Emptiness for some translation. We started on the water book. We did two episodes on the fire book, covered that one, and we tried we started with the water book, and we covered just a number of the kind of the subhead not chapters, but the paragraphs on different topics. Spiritual bearing and strategy. We covered the stance and strategy, the gaze and strategy, holding the long sword, and that's where our last episode ended. We were talking about the grips and how a sword is held according to Musashi and his thoughts. The next one was going to be footwork, and that's going to be what launches us into this episode. But before we get into the footwork part, one of the things that always struck me in reading the Book of Five Rings is how did Musashi categorize these topics into being related to water? Because sometimes you read some of these and you're not sure, like, how does your gaze, how would you classify that into one of these different books, whether it's fire or I think it's the ground, wind, that sort of thing. I think you could kind of open that to a different interpretation. But any thoughts that you all have had on this?
It's more woo-woo.
Got to put it somewhere.
I honestly thought that it would, as I was saying in the pre-show, sort of, it would be more Taoist, flowing, and I don't really necessarily see that as much. Maybe you guys can help me see that, but I read this and went, it's cool, and it's less woo than the rest of the stuff, but I couldn't figure out the water and the flowing part.
Sure.
Oh, I absolutely see that. It's because he talks about don't be fixed, don't be hard, don't be fluid, be mobile, be adaptable, be, you mentioned, Bess, you mentioned earlier Bruce Lee's, Master Lee's quotation, empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water. Put water into a cup, become the cup. Put water into a teapot, becomes the teapot. Water can flow or creep or drip or crash. Be water, my friend. I think Musashi I think the whole book is in a lot of ways about combining all of these elements. And I don't think we know enough to understand to intrinsically understand the conceptualization of the elements as Musashi thought about them, of fire, earth, wind, water, and the void, those elements. He talks about five guards, he talks about five elements, he talks about these five scrolls or books. I think in this one, though, I keep seeing fluid, I keep seeing adaptable, I keep seeing flexible, I keep seeing things that evoke water to me.
Yeah, and I had a very deep discussion about this years ago with a friend of mine, and who talked about being out of kind of a form of ki, which is how you express your body or how you move and things like that. And within that, we struck on the fact of, okay, so what would be the difference if water is fluid and moves around? What's the difference between water and wind? Because wind does the same thing, but water has a different quality than wind. And where is the kind of the power of it? And that is the difference. The underlying difference is that water has weight and gravity. So when water moves, it is a powerful motion. And if water hits you, it will move you. Whereas when wind hits you, you often don't really feel it. It moves around you, but it doesn't affect you with the power that water has of the crashing part. And that's what Bruce Lee talked about. Water can crash, and I have always admired water for its power that way. If water's fast moving and you walk through even a foot or foot and a half of water, it will just sweep you away. You don't even have to be submerged into it for it to take you where it's going. Wind can do that too, but it takes a lot more wind than the water to actually do the same thing, to achieve the same goal. So I agree with you, though. I think that this chapter does talk a lot about the shifting and adaptability and the motion, with like we're talking about holding the long sword of the grip. I'm not sure I connect that one as much, except when he wraps it up and he says, I really like rigidity in both the long swords and the hands. So talking about that hard grip, and I think that's where we ended the last episode of not having that white knuckle hard grip on the hilt of your sword. And it's a fluid motion thing, but it has that power within it when you apply it the right way, or where you cinch up your ring finger or pinky finger to cinch on the sword to get that snap at the end of it.
Which is interesting, because typically in the SCA we talk about a grip more like the last fingers are loose, whereas he's talking about gripping here and the front fingers are loose, and I've seen that before. And the thing that makes me think of is the way a punch is taught, that it's loose, your hand is loose until you make contact, and then you tense. Right. And if you are this way, it's harder to finish the punch here, because you're striking here. So to do this and finish the punch with these fingers, I think it reminds me of something that Fiore de Liberi teaches in his work, which goes from unarmed wrestling, unarmored with a stick, unarmored with all the way through until you're armored and armed. And it seems to me in this, the punch is the basis, in the same way Fiore talks about the wrestling being the basis for stances used with weapons. It seems to me in this, the punch is the basis for the sword and the tightening at the end. It's the same movement, and that makes sense to me, that it would be taught as the same movement, and it would eventually leading to the use of weapons. So
right. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we're just working today on the same body mechanics used for punching as for takedowns, grappling. It all is the basic same thing. Of course, we went from punching to closing in, but what you're talking about is going from punching range out to where you're actually using a weapon or an extension of the same body mechanic, all the way from the grip through the power chain, through the elbow, shoulders, hips, body, all of the legs, all the way down to the feet. And I think that gets us kind of to the first topic to pick up in the chapter where we left off, which is talking about footwork. And I know Brannos is trying to join in. I think he's running into some technical issues. And footwork is his main thing, and it really is mine too. I think that the idea that you win and lose fights by your footwork is absolute true. I don't think there's really any argument that really says, oh, no, it's not about the feet, it's about the hands. And not just controlling range in either, but shifting all around your opponent and to be a place where he really doesn't want you to be. Now, unfortunately, the mention of footwork only gets 2 very short paragraphs within it. However, each of the sentences here, I think, is worthy of some close examination. And let me just read these two little paragraphs out, and then we'll kind of I think we should take each sentence and kind of tear it down a little bit.
Just I have an alternate translation too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love you guys have alternate translation, because it is very difficult to translate things from Japanese into English. Even the best translators admit that they struggle with it. There's a lot of meaning and whatnot that tends to get lost just because of the language issue. So it will take a little bit for us to get really into it. So let's get started. It says, so here's the whole two little paragraphs. It says, with the tips of your toes somewhat floating, tread firmly with your heels. Whether you move fast or slow, with large or small steps, your feet must always move as in normal walking. I dislike the 3 walking methods known as jumping foot, floating foot, and fixed steps. So-called yin-yang foot is important in the way. Yin-yang foot means not moving only one foot. It means moving your feet left, right, and right, left when cutting, withdrawing, or warding off a cut. You should move on one foot preferentially. Talks about with the tips of your floating, tread firmly with your heels. And welcome, Brannos. I'm glad you could make it. Your timing is perfect.
Great.
We tried to finish up footwork before you got here.
Back home for this one.
And that's the episode. Thank you all for joining us.
Actually, before we get into the discussion of the individual ones, could you read the other translations just so we have that one in our minds as we go through these?
Yeah. In your foot, and so the translation, Tristan, you were reading from is the 73 Harris translation. Translation I'm reading from is the 2005 Cleary translation.
Okay.
In your footwork, you should tread strongly on your heels while allowing some leeway in your toes. Although your stride may be long or short, slow or fast, according to the situation, it is to be as normal. Flighty steps, unsteady steps, and stomping steps are to be avoided. Among the most important elements of this science is what is called complementary stepping. This is essential. Complementary stepping means that you do not move one foot alone. When you slash, when you pull back, and even when you parry, you step right, left, with complementary steps. Be very sure.
Better translation.
What's that?
That's a way better translation.
It's much more contemporary language, so I think it's more accessible.
Yeah.
And I've looked for this one particularly because it's highly regarded by a number of people, but I don't know if I don't know who it is that's highly regarding it. So be very sure not to step with one foot alone. This is something that demands careful examination. Sounds familiar. So the one thing that occurs to me is something I've been taught, which is when you're pivoting.
My laptop ain't working, so I'm trying to fix stuff.
When you're pivoting forward, you pivot on the ball of your foot, and when you're pivoting back, you pivot on your heels. And that's a movement method, and it seems like it's related. You might be on the balls of your feet, but you're not necessarily gripping with your toes. You're not tensing your feet. Your feet are light. You are treading lightly. We would call it being light on your feet, I think.
So, Brannos, when we've been practicing footwork, we're working on not walking with our heels, keeping our weight our heels sort of off the groundish, more on the balls of our feet, ready to sort of push and explode. If we had to say, where is the weight on our foot? I think we've been talking more about the balls of our feet, and that ties in with boxing. Would you like to do a compare and contrast for these two things?
Well, I think, I think there's one big piece here is, as we look at a contemporary view of what footwork is in a lot of ways. So he talks early about this being kind of a little on the front of your feet. But when he talks about essentially his heels, and I would follow that. Eli kind of nails it here. As you go backwards, you're going to naturally fall onto your heel some, but as you go forward, you should be stepping with the front of your foot. And again, it doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means that we do it a different way. I think when you look at the way they talk about it in this book, they talk a lot about the flow of everything. And that includes the flow of footwork. So he talks about making like step, like essentially walking. Well, we walk from, we walk pretty, depends on there's lots of different ways to walk. Some people strike the heel first. Some people strike the ball first. Some people are just flat footed. But the idea is to be comfortable in what you do, I think. I think, the hard piece there is if you're on your heel, you're essentially stuck to the ground. So you have to be careful there. If you're always on your toes, then I think the big piece where they talk about in period is the strike itself. You don't have as much, this is boxing as well, by the way. You don't have as much ground to develop power from. So even in boxing, you don't have as much power. And they proved this. They had some tests they did to do it. You get more power with firmly planted on the ground, but it's fundamentally you're stuck there a little bit more. It's where if you're a little more on your toes or in travel, in other words, essentially striking while you're moving, then you don't get as much power. And we kind of know that from SCA, right? We look at people who really sit in, and when you're sitting into something, you can really, when you drop into your legs and you hook something, you're dropping into the ground, planting yourself, and then delivering.
Eliahu had referenced story fencers. Fiore, I think, was the fencing master. And I'm wondering if we have any fencers watching either now or later on YouTube. When fencers are moving, are they using a heel forward? And I'm wondering if it is similar to a sort of a fencing type motion, maybe a big step along those lines. Eliahu, I don't know if you heard, I was just saying you had referenced fencing earlier, the fencing master Fiore, or however you pronounce it.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if the heel, walking confidently on your heel, might tie into some sort of fencing move, like be similar to a fencing movement at all. Do you have any?
I'd have to go back into Fiore to look at his footwork. I know in modern fencing, and again, Master Bruce Lee studied modern fencing, there's the movement tends to be much more linear, but really involves heel and toe and that kind of movement. And recovering from a lunge is not done by lifting up, but by dropping back, which requires pushing off the front heel and bending the back leg to recover from it. Fiore, I'd have to, I don't remember. I'd have to go back into and look at that.
I think it's interesting because we had a conversation about this with somebody that's taking fencing in school now, that old way of kicking your heel, the idea of kicking, be able to shoot like a coin from the bottom of your heel actually isn't followed as much in modern fencing anymore.
Right. It is.
So they don't have as much heel in that kickoff as they used to. I think the big piece of all this is that, and through all of this, there's a lot you can listen to his text, and he talks a lot about your center moving instead of always pushing. Your feet should be following you in flow and not driving your flow unless you're bursting or something to that effect.
The difference in modern fencing, and the reason that it has gone to what it has gone to, is it's gotten further away from its origin as training for a lethal activity. And as it has done that, it only mattered, like in foil, for example, You just have to beat the other guy. It doesn't matter if you also get hit, as long as you hit first. And that is not what Musashi and Fiore and any of the fencing masters and any of them were talking about, because you don't want to get hit, because even you don't want to, you want to hit the other person, but you don't want to get hit in the process. So the footwork changed to, in modern fencing, to prioritize speed. I've watched a lot of modern, very high level fencing competitions, and there's very little in the way of parrying, and it's mostly just who can get there quickest, you know. And that is not that even in the what Musashi was talking about the Iado, the simultaneous attacks. It was certainly beautiful if they simultaneously attacked and struck and both killed each other. But Musashi would have none of that. He's going to attack and not get hit. So I think that's the reason that the footwork in modern fencing has changed.
I think it's also interesting when you look at what it's helpful to look at what he doesn't like, because that stomp foot, for instance, from Eli's translation, or the fixed step in the other translation, that's where to do that, you have to raise your foot up fairly high and drop it down. And so when you're doing that, you're pinning your other foot to the ground and you're tying yourself down. And so there's, I liked, so in the one, it's the jumping foot, floating foot, fixed steps. And Eli, you had, what were those three? The one was like jittering foot or something like that. It had a kind of,
flighty steps, unsteady steps, and stomping steps.
Yeah, flighty, steady, and unsteady. And so partly it's that balance between whether you're actually rooted to the ground to throw, but also you don't want to be so rooted that you can't move. And that's that balance between those two things.
And there are consistencies throughout history of fighting. And I don't think, like, when we see fighters that like to bounce, whether it's boxers or any other striking fighter that likes to be light on their feet and they're kind of bouncing around. I wonder if that's what Musashi was talking about when he mentioned the jumping foot, or the kind of the one that wants to hop around, thinking that that's going to allow him speed going laterally and that sort of thing. He's probably talking about the same thing, would be my guess. And from a psychological standpoint, if you're facing life and death, you're probably going to be very nervous, and you're probably going to be frightened of actually anchoring at all. So you want to try to float and be as elusive and evasive as possible. So I think that was probably a thing back in the day. Sorry, Brannos, go ahead.
Okay, no, I apologize. You hesitated on my end, but it's interesting because if you look, there's a lot of comparison between the whole water bit with Bruce Lee. And I think you probably talked about that a little earlier, but he's very bouncy. He's very on the fronts of his feet. He's very still fluid in movement. Later in this chapter, or in this book, they also talk about when to burst and when to do those things, right? So there's some contradictory stuff. It's not really contradictory. It just means, don't do one thing. You need to be broad, and they talk about fighting in the fighting on the mountain, fighting in a small room. All of these types of things, you have to be able to bring multiple weapons, footwork, all of those things, your mind and tactics to each type of fight. And I think that's really where he's going at is, hey, you go to the school that teaches jumping foot. That's all you do is jumping foot, because that's the one way. There isn't one way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, let's see. That was 26 minutes and 2 sentences.
Now, I'd kind of be curious as to what floating foot or fixed steps were probably, but I think we've probably all seen these things in SCA fighting. Whether it's plotting steps, which are particular, that makes my teeth itch. When you see the clumpy really sloggy kind of footwork. Now, it does occur to me too that that SCA fighting is missing one careful aspect, which will absolutely affect footwork, and that is you're going to die if you get outmoved. And to have that level of nerves, people move differently when they are very, very nervous. And I'm sure we've all had fights where we face an opponent who is very clearly a nervous wreck versus at least somebody who says, okay, I'm going to go fight, but if I get hit or I get vanquished, it's not that big a deal. I'll learn and whatever. Like, to me, that has a whole different effect on your body when you realize if you get beat, you're done. And I think there was probably a lot more nervous footwork in any instance where somebody's life was on the line. And that's where I think Musashi's words are very profound of seeing what he probably saw. And I would guess he probably saw a lot of nervous samurai. And he probably killed a lot of them. At any rate, so let's get to this. So the so-called yin-yang foot is important to the way. And I'm curious what Eli's translation has to say about this one, because it's such a simple sentence. Is it different in yours, Eli?
Yes. Among the most important elements of this science is what is called complementary stepping. This is essential. Complementary stepping means that you do not move one foot alone. When you slash, you pull back. When you slash, when you pull back, and even when you parry, you step right, left, with complementary steps. Be very sure not to step with one foot alone. This is something that demands careful examination. Mm-hmm. So I think it's so interesting that yin yang is the translation, the older translation, and that requires that people understand the essence of what that means. Mm-hmm. And whereas this translation says it's complementary stepping, and that means that you're, I think, keeping in the theme of water, you're flowing between your feet, not hard stepping right, left, right, but your weight is flowing back and forth, and you're moving, not just one big. We've all seen people take one huge step and overcommit themselves and be out of position, instead of taking smaller complementary, what we can call, and I'm going to call this from now on, complementary steps. Sure. Because I think that's useful.
Yeah, I think the big piece here is it's just a gathering step, right?
One of the things that, go ahead.
We all know that if you take a large step, you pin yourself to the ground. If you pin yourself to the ground when the other person bursts, you have no movement. So it's a pretty fundamental step that I would hope that most fighters know. The longer step they take, the more they're pinned to the ground. So this is the gathering step behind any type of movement.
And Brannos, when you say gathering step, could you illustrate with your hands what you mean by that?
So if I take this step, this foot gathers back to the normal position.
So you take a step and then it joins, and a step,
you got it.
And it joins.
Yeah.
That's because not everybody might use the same terminology, so it's always easier when we can see it, at least for me.
And really,
and the piece there is there's a lot of pieces in that movement that has to be watched. You have to watch going up and down while you're doing that. You have to watch balance if you're doing it from side to side, like Eli says. You have to lead with your hips in that, otherwise your body swings. Or maybe you're stepping hard over there and you plant one foot. That foot is planted with weight on it is a weak point. And even if you're gathering your other foot, you're still weak because you're off balance. So the idea is you slide over there on a flat and you catch yourself, and the other foot, you're trying to keep balance between both feet. So that's what the gathering step, or the yin-yang step, I guess.
I've seen in modern fencing again, in the lunge, people doing it incorrectly by overcommitting, by overstepping, and then being unable to recover from it, being unable to gather to it, the back foot up to it, being unable to pull the front foot back because they've overcommitted beyond their ability to manage that. They've gone go for broke sort of thing. And that's not the classical lunge. That's absolutely not the classical lunge. But I see that has been somewhat lost. So
I think there's a good comment in the comments here that might be worth trying to address there. Whoever wants to tackle that one. Just popped off. Isn't Musashi saying the step is if walking? If so, doesn't that
walking,
contract the idea of a gathering step?
Yeah. So, but in walking, we gather the back foot. So it's not just one step and then we stop. Walking is literally, it could be gathering that foot up or taking the next step. But ultimately you're trying to get the foot into a balanced position where neither foot is stuck to the ground.
So I think if we describe walking, you put one foot in front and then the next foot goes in front and then the next foot. And that's how we normally walk. With a gathering step, what we say is one foot takes a step and then you bring the other foot forward, but not past. And that's the difference. So walking is like this and a gather step is like this and up and this and up.
Now you just have to watch in most Japanese arts is, you're allowed to be right-handed. Congratulations. You're allowed to do certain things, certain ways. So, they talk about that, but ultimately it's, again, I think everything goes down to being smooth in your action and in flow all the time. So even if you're walking, you don't want to take giant steps, because the longer step you take, the more time that foot is stuck to the ground. You can test this, and this is I do this all the time with people. Take one step back. If you take a giant step back, can you continue going backwards? You're kind of stuck for a second, and then you kind of have to almost push yourself back. Compared to if you take a small step back, the next thing you know, it's so much easier and smoother. That becomes the big difference.
I think it's useful to think also about something referred to as the crescent step, which was widely practiced in all forms of the arts that Musashi would be familiar with, where you're actually moving this way as you step. So you are gathering this foot to here and then to beyond, and then this crescent way, which is protective. You're actually at any point you are still on guard and have good footwork in that.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways that gather step is to shorten a long step in most cases.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Then there's also just bringing up your feet underneath you so you're not overbalanced. And so a lot of it's I know a lot of times if you're just reaching to throw a shot, you're reaching with one step, you throw a shot, and if you don't gather that second foot behind you, you're way off balance. It's not just that you're pinned to the ground, but you're also off balance and you don't have your hips underneath you.
Yeah, and John Rungbalder in the comments mentions don't overgather either, because what happens in an overgather is some people will gather their foot all the way to the other one, and then you're off balance again. Tristan, I think we abused this one pretty good. You want to go on?
Yeah. I was getting abused by my connection, so I'm glad you guys kept going with it. I think this covers footwork pretty well. Obviously, libraries could be written on footwork. We could certainly spend entire episodes on all the nuances of footwork, but I think what I come away with these two sentences of be reasoned with your footwork. Don't be risky. Don't do, large lunges. Don't risk being unstable. Keep your stability as you do all your movements. So that's kind of the conclusion that I took away from that one. At any rate, the next one up is the 5 attitudes. And I'm eager to hear Eli's translation on this one, because this one says the 5 attitudes are upper, middle, lower, right side, and left side. It says these are the give, and I don't know what that means. Although attitude has these 5 divisions, the one purpose of all of them is to cut the enemy. There are none but these 5 attitudes. So
Before you go
Eli,
on, let me give the
yeah,
alternate
go ahead.
translation. Instead of the 5 attitudes, this is headed the five kinds of guard. The 5 kinds of guard are the upper position, middle position, lower position, right-hand guard, and left-hand guard. Although the guard may be divided into 5 kinds, all of them are for the purpose of killing people. There are no other guards besides these 5.
Okay,
So
everybody needs to buy Eliahu's translation of the book. It is way better.
it's not my translation. I didn't translate. Thank
yeah.
you. But
The translation that we put the link in the Facebook, honestly, guys, it's a much better translation than this is like the I see everybody have. And that makes so much better sense than I kind of figured it was something like that, but they don't say it. That is a way better translation. Because dang.
I think it's much more. I think it's why it's one reason why it's highly regarded is it is a translation of its time. It is much more contemporary language, and so as challenging as Musashi is to understand, and as much as Musashi means something different every time we come to him, his words, the impediment of outdated language is not necessary. I agree, it's a better translation. So,
I think one of the ways to look at this too would be that there's no guard that covers 100% of you. You always have to essentially leave something open, no matter what choice, and it's just a trade-off. If you cover yourself in the top half of your body, the lower half is going to be open, or what have you. And so I think that's what I take as these, what do you call them, the guards, or which is a better description than the attitudes. But to realize there's going to be something, a vulnerability that you have to account for, whether it's left side, right side. And I think if we look at, a right-hander fighting a right-hander with sword and shield, what those openings are. They change around. If it's a left-hander fighting a right-hander, those guards present different openings and different things that you have to watch out for, and different things that you target, which then leads into, okay, how do you get somebody to open their guard that's closed where you would like to hit them, or maneuver them so that they present an opening that will be easy for you to strike. Like this is the open door in this paragraph about those.
I posted a note, a translator's note in the comments. The word for guard is kame, which comes from the verb kameru, which means to build, set up, adopt a defensive stance, posture, or attitude. So he translates it as guard in this sense, but I can see why attitude, but it's a defensive attitude. I can see why the earlier translation said that.
Yeah, and actually they talk a lot more about attitude later on as well, including, because they go through everything, and I think some of these were in the Book of Fire, but they talk about how you're supposed to stand, right? And how you're supposed to, wrinkle your brow or do all of these things, and they even talk about don't be too relaxed and all of those pieces, so that your opponent always gets this same serious feeling about what is going on. And then they talk about then relax to pull your opponent into relaxation and strike, and all of these kinds of things. So, just be aware that just because they talk about something, attitude is a big one. Just because they talk about it doesn't mean it's like, oh, don't ever do this. It just means don't do it all the time. So even
I think that's what the next sentence kind of covers. Yeah. Go ahead, Eli. Read your translation for the next sentence.
Whatever guard you adopt, do not think of it as being on guard. Think of it as part of the act of killing. Whether you adopt a large or small guard depends on the situation. Follow whatever is most advantageous.
Mhm.
The upper, middle, and lower guards are solid guards, while the two sides are fluid guards. The right and left guards are for places where there is no room overhead or to one side. Whether to adopt a right or left guard is decided according to the situation.
Mhm. And I think in context, that left and right guard being fluid covers the fact that by focusing left and right, you are leaving your center line vulnerable. So the way you have to deal with that is through movement, because with those two, you really cannot close the center line. Now that's a little bit different if you've got a shield, but Musashi did not use shields. But that's kind of how I read that left and right being fluid.
And I think the comment about the upper and lower guards being solid corresponds very clearly with like Fiore and the German schools talking about like the and I've forgotten the name, the roof and the
Vomtag,
the board, yeah, and the lower guard, the boar's tooth, or those that are very strong and solid, as opposed to the fluidity of the right and left.
And I think you could say the same of the A-frame.
Sure.
To put it in the SCA context, is the A-frame is solid from a blows coming down from the top or from aimed at the head. Any comment on that one? All right, and I apologize. I've got some intermittent connectivity issues, so if I don't hear something back, it may be technical in nature as well. So
no, it's all good. I think like the piece again, it's like the A-frame. It protects from high guard, but then you have to watch low, right? Or from then you have to watch low. You have to watch center. But your outsides may be covered better. And I think any guards like that. The question is, where do you move that guard? And maybe high guard. You don't need high guard if you're in a room that has a short ceiling.
Right. Well, and with everyone, and I know every fighter, I know I was like this for the longest time of, okay, well, what's the best guard? What's going to be the most reliable? And really the answer is each has its trade-offs. The high guard does protect your head better, but it also tends to blind you more because you put things right in front of your face. It's easy to lose track, whether you're a boxer with their gloves up or whether you're got a shield and your hilt of your sword right in front of your face. It's easy to blind yourself. Whereas back in 18th century, they would lower their hands down and leave the head open, but they could see everything very easily. So it's not so much a which one's better as much as a what is the trade-off that you are getting for the greater protection or what you think is a lesser protection, better vision. And all of those play into, I think, the individual and what they find works best for them.
And maybe how they're trying to draw their opponent in to do something.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Well, and also in a life or death situation, you want to protect the head.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the fight ender right there.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right. And of course, the method for how you do that's where it comes to, all right, which guard do you take or which position do you have? And I find that when we think about guards, initially you think of it as a static position, but as the farther you go along, and I'm sure our listeners have some conception of this depending on how long they fought, but even the ones that have only been fighting a year probably realize that guard is only a position maybe for a second while you're transitioning to another position or you're closing in. And you realize for this next 1 second, I need to have my guard up because my head's vulnerable as I approach into range or as I'm approaching into the range or position that I need to be in. And once you're there, you're pretty safe. Now you can shift your guard to something where you're taking care of a bigger vulnerability. So it's not like a one static position. They tend to flow in and out and you go from one to the next as you need it.
That was one of the understandings of the medieval European manuals is that the guards depicted, the guards illustrated, are transitional positions between. They're not, don't stand there like that. That's a transitional position to something else. So I think that was an important understanding that
Definitely.
I think too,
coming to.
I think too, the what's happening in some of those books is that they're written by, and Musashi included, and he even talks about this a little bit, and that is it's written by somebody usually a very high level. And this is, so what happens in those circumstances is a lot of times they expect the people reading through these books to understand the basics, right? And so, and even more, you'll find that as people get better and better at something, that the lower pieces don't get talked about because they seem like a waste of time. So, and what they're trying to get to is the harder pieces that they are actually literally understanding better at the moment in time they write the book. So just beware that happens a lot in and like I said, Musashi talks a little bit about he wishes he could explain it a lot more, but you should learn it well or you should practice it well. All this other stuff. And what he's saying is you need to work yourself through the basics to get here.
And I think, if you want to bring it into everyday talk, imagine you're talking to an astrophysicist about astrophysicist stuff and you don't have any background. He's like, I apply the this formula to that and I take it and I add this formula, and you're like, I don't even know what those formulas are. And they're talking like, they're bringing in this concept and that concept, and we don't have it. And I think, Brannos, that's what you're saying with Musashi. He's talking physics to someone who doesn't have algebra.
Let's talk about SCA. I mean, it's no different than, we can pick any discipline, right? Let's talk about a Laurel that has tons of costume experience and talks about the distance of your stitches and stuff like that when you maybe don't even know how to hand sew yet, And so there's like, I want to, how do we even fold the material so I can hand sew this? Well, that's the expectation. You already know how to do hand, you already know what to fold or double fold and that basic stitch, right? But that's not necessarily
you flat fell now, in order to finish the seams, I recommend that you flat fell them, but the choice is yours. You might want to do a French stitch on them, a French seam, but that's really your own choice. But exactly.
Well,
exactly.
It applies to a lot of things. I've seen a lot of people ask, well, how do I paint? Said, well, first we start with drawing. First, we start with how to hold the drawing tool. Whatever it is, how do you hold it? How do you move? Real basics. You can't do the advanced stuff until you've mastered the basics. You can't know how to break the rules until you've learned what the rules are. So,
and the funny thing is that I bet Musashi actually said, well, that's what I just did. I told you how to hold the sword. I told you how to gaze. I told you everything else. That was the previous, 5 paragraphs. And so the funny thing is, for Musashi, that's the simple level. And for us, we're going, well, that's the physics, that's the PhD level. We're still trying to figure out how to actually get there. And so there is a disconnect there. And so I think it's interesting as we go on, just looking a little forward in this, he does actually go a lot deeper into each of those 5 guards. So it's probably worth taking a look at some of what he has to say about those 5 guards.
Yeah.
So the last paragraph of that is what is important in this path is to realize that the consummate guard is the position. The middle position is what the guard is all about. Consider it in terms of large-scale military science. The center is the seat of the general, while following the general are the other 4 guards. This should be examined carefully.
Bess, did you examine this?
Carefully, Brannos. I examined it carefully. That guy cracks me up. But it is interesting. What he's saying is, all things being equal, we say this is the starting stance, and that's what he's saying. Essentially, if I understand it, is the middle guard is the guard to come back to. The other guards, you start here and you go to the other places, but this, if I understand it correctly, is saying this is where we start from, or this is the return position.
Well, it also relates to the idea, very widespread common idea in Asian martial arts, that all movement starts from the center, the Sekatunda, the Hara, that movement balance, your chi, it's, this is one of the centers of that align along that center line. So this middle guard, I know this translator doesn't use the term spiritual it says mental state rather than spiritual, but there is an element of I think of spirituality connected with this, in a lot of ways. But
So-
we could have a whole episode on discussing what the meaning of spirituality is, but that's probably a different kind of podcast. So
Actually, I was just reading a book, and I think Tristan, didn't we talk about this a little bit? And that is the Mind of the Samurai. And again, it's a text that surrounds the same time frame that many of these books were written and translated. And they talk, essentially the physical, the mental, and spiritual side of fighting, and they detail what they believe each of those pieces are. Because the idea of the physical, we all know what the physical is. We have to learn the things we have to learn physically how to do things. Mm-hmm. The mental piece is we have to understand what we are doing and how to do them, the technique involved and why. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we can't make good decisions. The spiritual goes into that space of, it doesn't really kind of fit in the other two. And that's, what does confidence bring you, right? Mm-hmm. What to do, there's all of those pieces, believing in yourself, and
it's the heart, it's the character,
right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yes, episode on this. I would agree 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Was there anything else we wanted to cover with the guards, or should we move to the next one? Okay, I guess we'll move to the next one. Yep. So I have this as the Way of the Longsword as the header. Eli, would you care to read your text?
It also says the Way of the Longsword. Mm-hmm. To know the Way of the Longsword means that even when you are wielding your sword with 2 fingers, you know just how to do it and can swing it easily. When you try to swing the longsword fast, you deviate from the way of the longsword, and so it is hard to swing. The idea is to swing the sword calmly so that it is easy to do. When you try to swing a longsword fast, the way you might when using a fan or a short sword, you deviate from the way of the longsword, so it is hard to swing. That is called short sword mincing, and it is ineffective for killing a man with a long sword. When you strike downward with the long sword, bring it back up in a convenient way. When you swing it sideways, bring it back sideways, returning it in a convenient way, extending the elbow as far as possible, and swinging powerfully is the way of the longsword.
So this one actually parallels something that I heard a long time ago. And the concept is, and this comes from the Japanese sort of philosophy around sword work, is let the sword teach your arm how it wants to move. Don't push the sword or force the sword. You will, if you relax, you will feel how it wants to move, and you won't fight it, and you won't have to push it, drag it, clumsily wield it. That's what I hear when I read that, or when you read that paragraph. Feel how that sword wants to elegantly move on its path, and use as little as you need to deliver it to there.
So we talk about flow of movement, and now we're talking about flow of your weapon, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's the critical piece here, and it's kind of funny because we kind of ran into this a long while ago. I had somebody that was throwing a sword shot, and the recovery was throw you essentially is stopping here, and then they're pulling this back,
Mhm.
which isn't necessarily a flowing recovery. Throw, roll, right back. Okay. And then if you look at other styles, like a lot of Western styles, there's lots of bang. This follows another line, follows another line, follows another line. That's flowing of the weapon, right?
Mhm.
So you can flow back to a position, you can flow back into another shot. But the idea is that you're creating a flow there. If you find yourself whang, and you're having to yank your body back, there's a lot of energy used there, and it's just like your feet. If I take a long step, I'm stuck for a second until I can get moving again. Same thing's happening with the weapon.
And I think if you keep that tight grip that we were talking about at the end of the last episode, you won't feel as much of how much you're forcing the sword. You're just going to have so much energy in it. But if you relax your hand, now you'll feel when your whole hand tenses to pull the sword back or to force it through an arc that it doesn't really want to go through. So you'll get a lot more tactile feedback from the weapon, and you'll realize how much you're fighting it by trying to push it around or send it through in inefficient vectors and arcs of motion. Okay.
I think one of the questions would be, since it's translated for us as longsword, there were different swords. They were not just a single length, and so we don't have. There isn't information in the translation that I'm aware of the specifications of the length of sword that's referred to as a longsword. However, the principle is the weapon informs you how it needs to be used if you can be sensitive to that, if you can understand. You must understand this, you must study this. if you can feel it, if you can, it tells you how it needs to be moved, how it wants to be moved. And I think that's the principle, that if a longswords of different lengths will move differently. And I mean, Musashi cut down an oar and used that in one of his famous fights. So
Ganru Island, I think, was that one.
Yeah.
One of the
bit of
ways
controversy though on that one, because they thought he did that to make it a longer weapon.
Yes, because his opponent was known for using a slightly longer than typical sword and using that additional range for it. But a lot of times, I mean, how many times have we seen new fighters that you feel them pushing their sword out to the target and they're struggling, and they say, how do I fix this? What they want to do is feel the glide, that really nice smooth arc with the good body mechanics and the grip and everything behind it. And one of the things I found that was tremendously helpful, and this goes right through the mental part, is the whole magnet theory thing. Think of your sword tip being a magnet, and it's just being pulled right to the target rather than you pushing the sword. And just introducing that one mind change of, imagine your sword wants to go to that target and you're just letting it rather than you're trying to push it there. And man, I've seen some really fast turnarounds with people that go, oh, it just in how I look at this now, it's easier. Not to say that they perfect it right away, but you can see a big change from the push aspect into the let it go where it wants to go, which is right into somebody's helmet.
I think a number of people are hampered by never having really felt a well-made sword, an actual well-made sword. I mean, there's so many overbuilt, understrung, heavy wall hanger decorations,
Sword-like objects.
sword-shaped objects that don't actually move. Like, can we actually have conversation without moving our hands? Is that possible? It's different. The first time I remember, the first time I handled a really well-made sword, it moved. It was like the difference between driving a big heavy truck and driving a tuned sports car. Thinking about it moved it. And I think some people are hampered by that, and consequently they don't know how to shape and balance their rattan facsimile weapons. They don't know how to do that. And so I've seen some that reminded me of the first rattan sword I ever made, which was a club. It was heavy. It was amazing that I could even move it. But I think that's something, again, it gets back to a weapon will inform you how it needs to be moved if you can pay attention to it. But there's some that can't be moved well because they're not well made.
That's a good point. Very much so.
So just a real quick, the book that was translated that I listened to was, they talk about, I think it was pre-10th century, the longsword was actually straight. It was not curved because it was used with shields and for stabbing. Later, when horses where richer people took on more vassals, they were able to keep more horses, so more horseback fights started, and that long sword, the stabbing sword, just wasn't convenient. The slicing sword was convenient. So that's when they started getting the curves on those swords. So it's interesting how, to me, I thought it was very interesting in how the weapon was based and changed based on how it had to be used at the time.
Absolutely.
One of the things I was trying to say before when I couldn't unmute myself was the other thing I found was just if you fight with, even with a rattan greatsword, you'll find that, I mean, he speaks against the short sword chopping or the short sword mincing. And if you try to fight with a greatsword like that, you try to just snap it in and just chop, it doesn't work. It has to flow. And so some of that just is straight up, it doesn't work if you try to, do it this way. So do it the right way.
You must study this.
You have to use the weapon in the way that works for the weapon. Like that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So trying to use an axe, like, let's get ridiculous. If you're in the SCA, trying to use an axe like a sword isn't gonna help you. The head is heavy, it'll twist in your hand. It's not gonna work. A long sword is fundamentally different than a short sword, and trying to use it in the same way as a short sword, you can't. It's like, I don't know, trying to turn one of my dogs into a racing dog. It's just not going to happen. They're couch potatoes. Never going to change.
And I'll share a little secret here that I remember way back in the day, and that is that Brannos actually did a number of years fighting with mace. And that is a different weapon than a sword, but I recall him telling me how much it taught him about the nuances that a mace has that can be translated into a sword. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit, if Brannos, you can remember back that far.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because with a mace, this follows the same thing as an axe itself. It's really head heavy. So the idea has to be flowing motions. So if you throw it, it has to be rolling motions to get back. So with a sword that's better balanced, the idea is you still have a rolling motion, but it can be smaller. So, but with a sword, you have to add more power to the end because you don't have the power following the end of the sword. Where with a mace, you can pretty much just drop it on somebody. So as long as you start and at the end, your hand could be literally open And especially if you're throwing a wrap or you're throwing even just dropping it straight in here, you don't have to hardly power anything into those because there's power there already. So, it's the idea is you take the benefits of a mace, more wraps, more leverage, more changing angles because you're able to use loose hand a little bit more. The heads are bigger, so they obviously impact before like a sword would. Where with a sword, then you probably have, even if you have a short sword, you have other options. Stabbing's easier. The head is lighter. It recovers much faster, as long as you're recovering the right way. So the trick there is that fundamentally all of these things kind of have to operate the same thing. Even if I grab a great sword, like Sivrid was saying, if I throw it out there and try to pull it back, it just you're going to get hit before you even have a chance to get that sword halfway back, and then you have to pull it back and then stop and then do it again. So you have all these stopping motions instead of bang, roll, bang, roll, bang, right? So you have all of that flow in there, which you don't have a lot of stopping motions. Also, in each of those stopping motions, you have to recreate energy, which is tiring.
And it takes energy to stop. So you're throwing and using energy, you're stopping and using energy. And then, as Brannos says, you have to start all over again, as opposed to if you're flowing. Apparently, we can't talk without using our hands. But if you're flowing, you're using the momentum, you're using your body, you're using everything to go with the weapon. And it will tell you what it wants to do.
And I remember too, back to that era. And one thing that I think that built this very solidly into Brannos's repertoire, which was crossing, because the mace was shorter, almost always his opponent got the first shot. So that built his ability to defend that first shot effectively very, very well. So if you're one of those fighters that's thinking, well, what can I do to maybe shake up and build a part of my fighting that I'm lacking that I could use, maybe changing your weapon might be something to explore that will help you build something that's a deficiency that you might have, like falling for that first shot, for example.
So you have to be careful, because if I were just to wait defensively and block shots, I would never get in range. So Musashi talked about this all the time. You're not defensive. You don't think defensive. You think this is, I am killing, and on the way in, defense happens. But the ultimate of this is to kill your opponent, to defeat your opponent. So even like I'd wait until that person starts throwing. The block was there, and then he gave me that first step, and he's planting on the front foot. He has momentum coming forward, so I take that momentum and cover that range. That same thing as Musashi talks about all the time. I will never have, and he says this in the Book of Fire, you will never have initiative if you're the one waiting.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot, I think, that having a shorter weapon that taught you about how to cross that range, how to be aggressive and assertive, but make up for the range deficit that's a pretty comprehensive skill set. And,
I'm
had you had a 34, 36-inch sword, would it have developed as quickly or to the depth that it did? Maybe, maybe not. But it's certainly because of the mace range difference, you had to build that.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. What do we got next?
All right. So the next one up. So it goes into the depths of the five guards. Is that the one?
Yeah, I read through that. I think, is there much there?
I don't know if we need to cover these in depth.
Well, some of it, if you go into that first one, it's actually talking exactly what we were just talking about there. It's that the first one is you block the initial attack and the counterattack into it. The second one is you time the attack into it. So I think it's worth at least going through quickly, because that's exactly what we're talking about, just in Musashi's words instead of ours.
Yeah.
So go ahead and just.
I'll read the first one. It's the first approach is the middle attitude. Confront the enemy with the point of your sword against his face. When he attacks, dash his sword to the right and ride it, or when the enemy attacks, deflect the point of his sword by hitting downward. Keep your longsword where it is as the enemy renews his attack, and cut his arms from below. This is the first method. The 5 approaches are this kind of thing. You must train repeatedly using a longsword in order to learn them. When you master my way of the longsword, you'll be able to control any attack the enemy makes. I assure you there are no attitudes other than the other 5 attitudes of the longsword of Nito. Is that very different from, Eli, what you have?
The first paragraph is similar. The guard is in the middle position with the tip of sword pointed at the opponent's face. It's very similar. The second paragraph differs a bit. These 5 formal techniques can hardly be understood just by writing about them. The 5 formal techniques are to be practiced with sword in hand. By means of these 5 outlines of swordplay, you will know my science of swordplay, and the techniques employed by opponents will also be evident. This is the point of telling you that there are no more than 5 guards in the 2-sword method of swordsmanship. Training and practice are imperative. So it's it's similar. I think he's saying there are 5 guards. This 5 techniques or 5 approaches, 5 techniques in this translation. The first one is, deflect, and is that eventually, you're cutting their hands from below. The second one is also from below, but I think they're very similar in the translation. The words are different, but essentially, in summary, they're very similar.
Sure. And I think that what he talks repeatedly about attacking from below has partially to do with raising the blade up to cut, which seems to be prevalent in the Japanese sword style. So, which, of course, when you raise your hands, now you're vulnerable underneath, and so that's something to appreciate. In my opinion, bastard sword or 2-handed sword is probably the harshest of all of the medieval weapon styles that the SCA has, or that really was done. I think it's the most high risk, it's the most dangerous, and the harshest one for mistakes. You really have to do it well, or you're going to get killed. And for any SCA fighters are thinking, I want to take up the 2-handed sword, which that was one of the ones I started with. Just be ready for a beating. I mean, you're going to get shoulders hit, arms hit. There's really nowhere to hide. It doesn't really have any of the advantages except for, I guess, tip speed, quickness, but everything else is a deficit against every other style. So it's a tough road to travel if you decide to take that one on.
Yeah, and so in the other translation, the second one there is also it's attacking in time as opposed to attacking in response, and so that seems to be the main difference between the first 2 methods that he has. The first is block and attack. The second is attack, cut the enemy just as he attacks, and so that's just a matter of changing the timing from one to the other.
Yeah, and we've talked about that in previous episodes, where the 3 timings of attack, the sen, go no sen, and sen no sen. And this is exactly it, without in so many words. I don't know if the original Japanese used that terminology or not in this book.
What's the third one, Sivrid? Is it attack before your opponent?
The third approach is a lower attack, anticipating scooping up when the enemy attacks, hit his hands from below. As you do so, he may try to hit your sword down. If this is the case, cut his upper arms horizontally with a feeling of crossing. This means that from the lower attitudes, you hit the enemy the instant that he attacks.
Right.
I think that is the intercepting attack, yeah.
That's the intercepting attack.
Yeah.
And just to go quickly through the other 2, the fourth approach, adopt the left side attitude as the enemy attacks, hit his hands from below. If, as you hit his hands, he attempts to dash down your sword with the feeling of hitting his hands, parry the path of his longsword and cut across from above your shoulder. This is the way of the longsword, though this method you win by parrying the line of the enemy's attack. You must research this. In the fifth approach, the sword is in the right side attitude in accordance with the enemy's attack. Cross your longsword from below at the side to the upper attitude, then cut straight from above. This method is essential for knowing the way of the longsword well. If you cannot use this method, you can freely wield a heavy longsword. And then
Yeah,
the
I
very
think-
last line of that section is you must consider all of this carefully.
Yeah, of course. I think of what's, the piece here is he gets into detail of what's happening in those, but most of this is, I think he's positioning. So he's talking about, you actually end up changing these into, if it doesn't work, then again, they talk about this later, but if it doesn't work, then you try a different thing. And these, you layer attack types. And it's the same thing we do, right? I'm going to throw this combination. All right, that didn't work. I'm going to throw this combination. Okay, that didn't work. And then you look and see how the responses was, and then see if you can throw a combination or a something in the effect that will take advantage of what you saw.
Yeah.
But the idea in this is, here are 5 basic things to do. Or basic combinations. Doesn't mean that the only ones again. It's just like, same thing with movement, same with the sword stuff. It's not the only thing. These are complex. Talk about timing. You can change that timing. Each one of them talks a little bit about change of timing. You change sides and how those apply to your opponent. So that's, I think, what he's getting at.
That is exactly what he's getting at. In a startling moment of clarity in this book, Musashi says, I can't describe in detail how to use these 5 approaches or guards. You must become well acquainted with my inharmony with the longsword. So how does the weapon work? Learn large-scale timing, understand the enemy's longsword, and become used to the 5 guards from the outset. I like his next line because it's full of confidence. You will always win by using these 5 methods with various timing considerations, discerning the enemy's spirit. So again, Brannos, you perfectly paraphrased Musashi's unusual bit of clarity.
Some of what he's talking about does seem to indicate if this, then this, if this, not this, then this. You deflect, and whatever you do, it flows into the attack. From this position, you've intercepted and you flow into this position. But he also says you have to, the translation you read said you understand your enemy's spirit, and in this way it's the minds of your opponents.
Yes.
The spirit of their minds, which is,
yeah. And if we bring it back to SCA, this is very much when somebody brand new asks a fighter of any experience, what do I do every time or in every situation? And we always say there's no one answer. You're gonna do this or you do that. It depends on the situation, which I know is a horrible answer to people who want, this is what, if you always stand in this way, then it's always going to work for you. But it doesn't always. Sometimes you take a bigger step. Sometimes you take a sideways step. Sometimes you take a step backwards. Sometimes you got the option of either one of these. The choice is up to you and what your body likes to do. He's quite specific, and I like that about him. Thanks, Musashi.
So I guess, go ahead.
Yeah, there's also, I think, in an SCA situation in fighting with a certain amount of experience, you can see somebody and you can know what they're going to do. You can sense their spirit. You can know their mind. You can say, I know exactly where they're going to go. I know exactly how they're going to move. I know exactly what they're going to do. I have already won because I can tell. I have sensed it. And that, we pick up cues like you can see where the damage on the sword is. You can see, you can tell how their reach by their stance and their length and their height and their length of their weapons and so on. But more of it is you can see somebody who's just there, they're going to charge. You absolutely know. You can see somebody who is timid. You can see somebody who's relaxed and comfortable. Go, okay, this is going to be a fight. This is going to be interesting. You can sense that. So I know exactly, I have a sense of what he means by that, understanding the enemy's spirit or your opponent's mind.
And to tie it into melee, because who doesn't like tying this into melee, right? Say you're on
well, Musashi does it all the time.
Say you're
He
on
does.
Well, but say you're on a bridge and you see a bunch of shields suddenly coming forward and moving over. What do we say? They're going to charge on that side. We know and we prepare for it. Or, you can see them pulling back. What are they doing? They're making a killing pocket. We can see what they're doing. We can read what they're doing. So it's not just in singles. It will also be in melees. Yay, melee.
So Bess, I think you should listen to the book I have, because he compares he talks about this all on the tactics end of it. And tactics means essentially, same with throwing a blow could be, act before the other army acts, act at the same time the other army acts. And he talks like a lot about tactics, because that's really what he wanted to do and never really got to do a lot of. And so he does it on the personal level, but he does it a lot of times. He'll go back to show you or tell you about how this is done on a large level, number of people. So I think you'd probably enjoy the one I have, because he talks about that a lot. And it all is, every example he is talking about here is defined against an army.
That sounds cool. I'm sure other people would love to hear about it in melee. So maybe we drop a link into the Facebook chat so we can all see or find the link.
So, and we were talking about the mind here, and Eli was talking about that a lot. About the second part Eli was talking about is what I call connection, making a connection to your opponent. This isn't a mental connection, it's a physical connection. There's a connection, that spiritual connection, that essentially allows you to read what your opponent's feeling. Good therapists do this all the time. Somebody be perfect. You'd be sitting there watching, and somebody will say this, and that therapist will go, "You're lying." And it's like, wait, how do you know? He's like, yeah, I'm lying. Okay. Because they can make the connection and see cues. Most of it really comes around cues around the body, and they teach cues in that scenario. But that deeper connection you can make, the earlier you can read your opponent. This is why I like Rongvalder. This is, I one time I went at practice and I recited something to him, because it talks about strike before your opponent thinks of striking. Well, what's really happening is they start thinking about it, and then you execute before they can even actually get into position or start to throw. They're thinking, you're doing. And so it's a really interesting subject, but that's that connection that defines that. But let's go back one step, where we're talking about we have to make decisions on what we're going to do based on our opponents as far as a technique goes. So I could say, I'm going to do this technique. Okay, stop, pull back. I'm going to do this technique. Stop, pull back. This is no different than I'm going to throw this blow. Stop, pull back. It takes as much effort to stop and pull back and start again. Like we talked about in movement and a sword. It's a lot of mental effort to do that. Instead, we're talking about the flowing mind. I'm going to do this, bang, bang. I saw this. I'm going to change my method of attack based on what I saw, but there's not a stopping point. It's flowing through all those changes.
Mm-hmm. And the same way where when people go through and they say, all right, I've worked up this really great 3-shot or 4-shot or 5-shot combination, it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no matter what happens in between 1 and 5, versus a good fighter who it will look from the outside like a 5-blow combination, but he's looking at 1. Now what can I do for 2? I redirect my 2, and there's an opening for number 3. So it's a whole different mind engagement that's going on. He's not just running a preset program until the end. I know I got caught in that, back as a young fighter, where it's like, oh, there's a great 3 or 4 blow combination. I'm just going to let her rip. And as soon as somebody notices it, they know what's coming in the next 2 full seconds. And so it stopped working.
And we have to remember, this is all very advanced, right?
Yeah. Many years ago, I played a game of chess against the king at an event. But I knew him. He was a friend of mine. And so I put my queen out there, and I knew from watching him in Melee, which chess is, I knew that he would focus on one opponent and chase them no matter what. He would ignore he would lock on and just keep chasing them around. So I put my queen out there, and he chased my queen around. Meanwhile, I was maneuvering my other pieces into position. He finally caught my queen, and the next move I checkmated.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that. I knew him. I knew his mind. I knew his spirit. I knew who he was because I had seen him fight. So
Rongvalder and I had a really great chess game years ago, and a similar kind of thing happened. It wasn't as well planned as yours, but I knew that Rongvalder's mind was such that he is a very patient, deliberate, thoughtful person. And I knew I didn't know how good of a chess player was, but I guess he was probably pretty good, because that's what made him a successful fighter, is what would make him a good chess player. And I just knew I can't give him time to think, and I need to basically just keep him in a hurry. And It was, ask him about it, he'll laugh, and I laugh, because it was the chess game was pure chaos. And when it was over, he held his head in his hands, was like, why did I let you rush me? What was I in a hurry for? Just because he'd sit, the first few moves, he'd sit and he'd watch and he'd think, and he'd make a move, and I just looked down and boom, I just make a move, and I drew him into thinking into a space where that wasn't his comfort zone, because I knew if in his comfort zone, I was toast. So it is fun to play chess with people. And Osis was the same way. He played chess like he fought, which was weird, very aggressive. He brought his knights out, and he would just harass anything in the middle of the board with them. He'd leave all of his pieces behind his pawns and play in this oblique attack kind of way. But it's interesting to see, like you said, how people's mind, it's the same as in fighting as in playing chess.
Yeah, it's interesting because and I just posted it, but this is exactly what Josh Watkins talks about in The Art of Learning, and he likes playing the middle game. Most people, when they learn chess, they learn a billion opening moves, and it's all about the beginning. And he likes pushing the middle game instead, and that's where people start deteriorating, because they spend so much time on the beginning of the game. And it's really, it depends on what you read from your opponent. He says he'd go to chess tournaments that last for like 7 days, and he liked them because they were small, groups of people in a hotel, and they would play chess all 7 days, and he would watch them at night. And he's like, he could tell if somebody ran in from the rain that they were all about controlling the board. If they just sat out there and sucked it up, they were okay with chaos. Right. And then you play towards the other end of it, as you're balanced enough. Again, we're going balance back to Musashi here, to play the other way, to draw the weakness out of your opponent.
Yep.
If my opponent clearly likes to stay at range, I will get really close. If they clearly like to get in close, I'll keep moving and keep them at range. Because I'm trying to deny them their comfortable ground to make it more difficult for them, because I'm comfortable at any of those ranges. And so I think that, exactly.
Well, I think we could probably wrap it up. We're at about 90 minutes, and I would not want to cut short the next topic within this book. So what we have coming up next week or in 2 weeks, I should say, I guess we're going to try to do live from Great Western War. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's actually, we're definitely going to try to do it live. I think we got a couple people there. Live episodes are always tough, so we'll see. I think in the meantime, I'm going to probably work with Tristan on maybe a episode that could essentially take its place if something falls through. I know we have this, mind, body, spirit idea, and I'd like to run with it. I think, Tristan, we talked about something else a couple of weeks ago as well.
Yeah, I put up an idea for it was the Customato character.
Yes.
He talked about character of a fighter and how that is often the difference between success and failure is and I think this is the spirit layer, right? The not what you think, but what's in your heart underneath. And Customato, for those who don't know, was Mike Tyson's trainer. He was also trained Floyd Patterson, 2 heavyweight champions, one of the best minds in the boxing realm in terms of crafting fighters into champions. And so I think the words that he had were very profound for bringing the best out in people. And as coaches, that's what we want to do, right? Is bring out the best in ourselves and in the people that we're coaching and training. So I think that'd be a good episode to dig into a bit. So, all right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you to all the coaches for this thoughtful discussion. I know it's been a while since we've gotten to the Book of 5 Rings, and there may be a little bit of gap before we finish off this water book. I know the water book is a long one, so I think we're now at about halfway through in 2 episodes. So there's plenty to dig into. So until we have another episode, go out and get some good fighting in and some good training. Everybody have a good night.
And thanks everybody for participating on the SEA Coaches Corner. It's been a great week to read a lot of great stuff out there. And all the help that people have given others. So keep it up.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.
Have a good night and a great weekend.